Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to Dina, where are you, in the Humanities Center for putting these brown bags together. And also thanks to all of you for being here today. As Dr. Edwards said, I'm Michelle Jacobs. I'm in the Sociology Department, and I'm here to talk about urban American Indian identity. So I just want to start off by showing you what happens when you type American Indian into the Google Images search engine. This is the first page of images that comes up, and as you can see, there's a bit of a theme. All of the images are black and white or sepia colored to indicate that they're historical. Lots of the Indians are wearing headdresses or war bonnets, which is actually unique to the plains, to different plains Indians like the Lakota, and not representative of the diversity of American Indian cultures that exist in the American continent. They're rather stern-faced, or what you might even call stoic, depictions of Indians. And what's missing is any representation whatsoever of an American Indian living in the 21st century. And even if you scroll down a bit, which we can't do, but you can go home and try it out, there are very few images of contemporary American Indian people living in contemporary society. Now, I'd like you to keep these images in mind as I read the following quotes from Linda Smith, who is an Indigenous scholar. Linda Smith says, "What counts as authentic is used by the West as one of the criteria to determine who really is Indigenous, who is worth saving, who is still innocent and free from Western contamination. At the heart of such a view of authenticity is a belief that Indigenous cultures cannot change, cannot recreate themselves and still claim to be Indigenous, nor can they be complicated, internally diverse, or contradictory. Only the West has that privilege." So the Google image illustration is a little oversimplistic perhaps, but it nevertheless supports Smith's assertion. And I think that together these two things provide a useful introduction to the work that I'll be sharing with you today. So my research focuses on American Indians living off the reservation, or in urban spaces where they can't avoid Western contamination, as Smith puts it, and consequently are overlooked, miscategorized, or deemed inauthentic by the people around them. My research highlights the role of institutions in reinforcing a particular understanding or a version or a brand of Indianness that makes urban Indians practically invisible. And I refer to this collection of images, or this branding, as the Indian imaginary. So today I'm presenting a much smaller piece of my larger project, and we'll be talking about how urban American Indians themselves reinforce popular fictions about American Indian people. And it's very much a work in progress. I'm going to be presenting it again at a conference in March, and then I'm developing it further as a research article that's not due until October, so I have lots of time to work on it, and for that reason I really appreciate any feedback that folks have, comments, questions, critiques. So we should care about urban Indians because demographers estimate that between 60 and 70% of the US Indigenous population lives in cities. And this information comes as a shock to a lot of people, which actually illustrates just how prolific the Indian imaginary is. Because this Indian imaginary promotes a rigid rural-urban dichotomy that places Indians on the rural side of that divide. So very, very little theoretical background here. Omi and Minot talk about racial formations as basically they're talking about race as a social construct. So race is not something that's inherent or makes people who identify within different racial categories as biologically or genetically distinct from each other, but rather social, economic, and political projects create and perpetuate these ideas that we are distinct members of, or that we're members of distinct racial and ethnic groups. And then they use the term racialization to talk about the process by which a particular group is raced, or by which they're defined as racially distinctive from other groups. So in the next few slides, I just highlight a few of the projects that contribute to the racialization of American Indians. First off, early on, American Indians were portrayed as inferior, uncivilized savages that were slowing the progress or the spread of European civilization across the U.S. continent, which just in this construction of Indianness was used to justify their forced removal from their homelands and their segregation on reservations during the period of Indian removal. And even today, Indianness, or really who has access to a politically legitimated Indian identity, is regulated by federal and tribal governments, which is unique in the United States. They are uniquely regulated in terms of their racial identity. The most prevalent regulatory mechanism is called quantum, and I have pictured for you a CDIB, or Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood, that I found on Wikipedia, that belongs to a gentleman named Morris Philip Constantine, who has been decreed to be 3/16 Cherokee, and is a member of the Cherokee tribe. So, social and cultural projects also construct Indianness in the United States. Here we have a smattering of images that are recent. So we have Johnny Depp as Tonto, a Victoria's Secret runway model, Indian mascots, the Land O'Lakes Margarine Girl. We can talk about numerous others, Apache helicopters, Jeep Grand Cherokees, Pocahontas, the Disney version that just came out recently. Those are recent, these are all recent constructions of Indianness, but Europeans have been somewhat obsessed with redefining Indianness for centuries. As Deloria points out, even the Boston Tea Party was accomplished by European colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians, and from there we had Wild West shows, Boy Scouts of America badges, New Age spiritual gurus, sports team mascots. All of these things indicate that the U.S. cultural sphere is inundated with the Indian imaginary. And it's really important to keep in mind that these racial projects create a spectrum of meanings of Indianness that are available to all members of society, including American Indians. So the research question I'm addressing today is simply, how does this Indian imaginary impact experiences of urban American Indian identity? And the research is based on an ethnographic study of American Indian life in Northeast Ohio. I did about 2.5 years of field work in 2 different urban pan-Indian communities. I went to nearly every Indian-sponsored event in Northeast Ohio during this time period, and I even went to some multicultural fairs that simply featured Indians as one of many diverse cultural groups. So I participated in protests, went to potlucks and barbecues, fundraisers for I sold a lot of Indian tacos and fry bread at powwows, for instance, while I was participating with these groups. And then I also conducted 39 formal interviews with people who self-identified as American Indian. The interviews were digitally recorded and transcribed by myself, so I could most accurately capture respondents' perspectives. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with a powwow, this photo I think sort of nicely captures the powwow scene in Ohio, which is a little unique. So it's like an American Indian festival where there are drummers, American native dancers, as you can see in the center of the circle here. Then there are vending booths where people vend crafts and t-shirts and food surrounding the circle, and spectators as well. And here, because it's Ohio powwow, the spectators are predominantly white, but if the powwow were on a reservation, then almost all of the actors present would be native. And I mentioned that there were 2 urban Indian communities that I participated in and observed. And the distinctions that are outlined on this slide are not hard and fast, But in a general sense, the communities differed along these axes. So I refer to members of the first community as relocators because they're more likely to have relocated to Ohio from Indian reservations. They're more likely to identify as full or half-bloods or quarter-bloods, and they're more closely linked to Indian nations and Indian reservations. Members of the second community, in contrast, are working to reclaim Indian identities that were lost to them as a result of historical circumstances often beyond their control. The members of this group, whom I refer to as reclaimers, had more remote Indian ancestries and were less connected to Indian tribes or reservations. These community distinctions are extremely critical to my larger project because relocators and reclaimers have very different experiences of urban Indian identity as a result of their different histories. But I think that they're still interesting here, albeit maybe a little less important, because what I'm talking about today is something that both groups have in common, which is that people don't or won't recognize them as Indians because they don't fit this stereotypical mold cast for American Indians in white supremacist society. And this is frustrating for both reclaimers and relocators. Even though relocators are seen as having more legitimate claims to Indianness or to Indian identities due to the ways that Indian race has been constructed in the United States, members of both communities engage in identity work that resists the Indian imaginary. Yet despite their conscious efforts to redefine Indianness in ways that affirm their identities, the urban American participants in my study frequently countered or upended their own resistance efforts with contradictory statements that reified false ideas about Indianness. So these include the idea that real Indians live on reservations, the idea that real Indians have a particular appearance or are visibly distinct from other racial and ethnic groups, and the notion that full-blood Indians are more real or authentic than mixed-blood Indians. And so every time that I say real Indian from this point forward, just imagine that there are quotes around it so that I don't have to give you air quotes every time. So, to illustrate how these contradictions seep into the thoughts and the speech patterns of urban Indians, I start with Sasha. Sasha is a reclaimer in her 30s, her early 30s. So she grew up in Northeast Ohio without any kind of socialization into Indian ways or Indian practices. But she has a real Indian family that is based on a Midwestern Indian reservation, and they've adopted her. And she travels out to see them for mentorship and also to go to ceremonies like the Sundance. So when I asked Sasha what makes someone authentically Indian, she quickly told me that it doesn't have to do with the color of someone's skin, it doesn't have to do with how much native blood they have, but what she's learned from her mentors is that all that really matters is following your traditions. And she's pretty adamant to me, it's not in the quote, but she's pretty adamant that she means real traditions, not stuff that's just made up, because that's what wannabe Indians do, or people who claim to be Indian but aren't actually. So that's it's one of the harshest put downs that someone can say to someone who is Indian identified, to call them a wannabe. Or there's a joke even in Indian country where they call them a member of the Wanabe tribe, for instance. So then, to validate her perspective on who counts as a real Indian, Sasha tells me that the views she's espousing come from real Indians straight off the res. And I think it's interesting that she puts the descriptor real in verbal quotes, because this indicates her awareness of socially constructed ideas about authentic indigeneity, and yet she's also revealing through her words that she takes pride in the fact that her mentors were born and raised on a reservation. So here's an illustration of the same idea, but from a really prominent relocator. In many respects, Berta, the author of this quote, was the grandmother of the relocator community. She was a highly respected elder. She'd been in the area longer than almost anyone else. She was a real mover and shaker in the community, so she was the chair of every committee. She was the chair of the powwow planning committee, the protest committee, the harvest dinner committee, the Easter egg hunt committee. Like, it didn't matter if you wanted access to this particular community of Native folks, then you needed to go through Berta for the most part. So she was in her 60s at the time of our interview, and she'd lived in Northeast Ohio almost continuously since the age of 13. She was 13 when her parents accepted the government's offer to relocate the entire family, 2 adults and 7 kids, from a Lakota reservation to Cleveland, Ohio. So they were voluntary participants in the government's Indian relocation program. Even though Berta spent much of her life in the urban environment, her ideas about authentic Indianness are so entangled with reservation life that she doesn't want, as you can see in this quote, the urban Indian label applied to herself. Right, so I'm not an Indian, or I'm not an urban Indian, I'm just an Indian, but I am an urban Indian, and then she ends with, I'd rather be just an Indian, you know, even though I am an urban Indian. So she sort of grudgingly admits that she is an urban Indian, but she despises that label because she equates it with not knowing one's culture and customs. She sees those things as being synonymous. And she asserts that she knows her culture more than some people on the reservation. So in fact, Berta is better connected to Lakota culture than some Indians who live on the reservation. And according to Berta, that's okay because they're busy surviving and they don't have time to worry about keeping up traditional practices. But in fiction, Indians off the reservation are not where they belong, right? So Berta doesn't want to claim the urban Indian label despite her longtime urban residence, and I believe that this reinforces the antiquated notion that real Indians live on the reservation and not in cities. So the quotes from Sasha and Berta provide examples of how urban Indians rely on reservation connections to bolster their claims to authenticity as American Indians. So, urban Indians also have a hard time divesting themselves of stereotypical ideas about Indian appearance. And here's a quote from Casey, who's also pictured on the slide. He's a reclaimer in his 60s. And you can see from the quote that it starts with unfortunately. He's disappointed in his appearance. He's really unhappy that he inherited blonde hair and blue eyes from his grandfather, actually. And he's unhappy about that because these phenotypic traits cause others to presume that he's white and not Indian. And I spent a fair amount of time with Casey at powwows because he vended handcrafted, hand-carved native flutes, right? Like the one that he's holding in the picture there. And I learned fairly quickly that he was really insecure about his identity, and that it all sort of boiled down to his appearance. Because he also had Cherokee mentors that lived on a reservation that he went and visited and learned customs from. And he'd been adopted by a family as well. But Casey was slightly embittered by decades of interactions with people who repeatedly questioned whether or not he was an Indian. And his first marriage actually ended in divorce because his wife repeatedly insisted that he wasn't Indian and should stop, quote, trying to act like one. So I'd hung out with Casey a number of times, and we'd already done the formal interview process when I was visiting him one morning at his vending booth at a powwow. And the powwow hadn't even started yet. It was really early in the morning. People were just setting up. And we were just having some casual chit-chat when Casey pointed to the powwow drummers that were setting up And he said, I bet you don't need a card to drum at this powwow, meaning that you probably didn't need to be officially enrolled in an Indian tribe to be drumming at the powwow. And then he said, hell, I look more Indian than they do. And almost as soon as the words came out of his mouth, then he realized that he was making the snap judgment, the same kind of judgment that people make about him that's really hurtful to his identity as an American Indian person or a Native person. And then he under his breath, he said, oh, see, now and here I go, to me. The only person who was there to witness what he had said. So here's another example, this time from a relocator. Samantha is a second-generation relocator in her 20s. Her mom relocated from a reservation to Northeast Ohio after marrying Samantha's dad, who is white. So Samantha identifies as a half-blood Cherokee. In this quote, Samantha's talking about going to powwows with her mom, who makes a concerted effort to introduce Samantha to people that she knows so that they recognize that she's Native. And Samantha's a little annoyed that her mom, who has darker skin, has to validate her own Indianness. At the same time, though, Samantha agrees in this quote that her mom looks more Native because she has darker skin. And that alone, or that, of course, reifies the notion that there's some kind of quintessential Indian appearance. But perhaps even more tellingly, Barbara and Samantha also make snap judgments about fair-skinned people at Ohio powwows and are quick to label them as white people and white hobbyists. And calling someone a hobbyist is fairly akin to calling them a wannabe, right, which I've already mentioned is an extremely harsh put down to someone who puts a lot of effort into developing this identity and learning cultural practices. And Samantha and her mom don't really seem to recognize that their actions reproduce the very same ideas that make it difficult for Samantha to assert her Indian identity to people who don't already know the family. Oh, I'm going to be done in no time. Time is not an issue. So finally, with respect to full-bloodedness, and I only just pulled a quote for this because I thought I'd been talking really long by now. But I love this quote from Kurt, who's a prominent 40-something reclaimer, whose dad actually founded the Reclaimer Community Organization, which is a nonprofit, and Kurt currently serves as the executive director of this Indian Center. And Kurt's an interesting case study because a lot of the work that he does is aimed at eradicating stereotypes about American Indian people. So for instance, he told me once that maybe a decade earlier, before I had met him, he had worn his hair long all of his life, and he decided just to cut it all off because he didn't want to, he wanted to fight these stereotypical portrayals of Indianness. And he even calls himself at one point in our interview the urban American Indian poster boy. And then he says, "Hear me roar," because he has this history that is much like many of the other reclaimers. They have to go back a generation or two to an Indian ancestor. They don't have a lot of cultural knowledge, but they're trying to discover it or unearth that. So in this quote, Kurt jests about the mysterious vision or fantasy that people have about natives with long black hair flowing in the wind, and feathers waving to you in the air. Images that are somewhat reminiscent of the Google image search, right? And he suggests that being Indian, what it really boils down to is action. It's not about brown skin and it's not about buckskin. It's about sharing whatever you have with the people around you. But he also says, I even ask some of the full-bloods who come in here, meaning into the Indian Center, as though full-bloods should be held to a higher standard, right? Or as though they have some sort of monopoly on the answer to the question, what does it mean to be Native? And in doing so, he reveals that blood quantum stubbornly remains part of his thought process when discussing authentic Indianness, despite his efforts to disentangle this imagined, pure Indian ideal type from actual American Indians and their experiences. So I just want to end by saying that it's important to recognize that racial projects so thoroughly define Indianness that not just urban Indians, but all American Indian folks in the U.S. Find it difficult to define themselves without referencing dominant, culturally pervasive ideas about American Indian people. As I've shown, the Indian imaginary seeps into their actions and words, even as they're actively working to refute and eradicate all of the images and mythologies that are bound up within this fictive Indian persona. And then I just want to end with a call for more scholarship on internalized oppression. Sociologists have sort of shied away from studying internalized oppression in recent decades, and for good reason. There were lots of studies that looked at internalized oppression at the individual level, and that can pretty easily lead to victim blaming, right, or holding the racially oppressed responsible for their own experiences of oppression. But I agree with Pike. He has a fantastic article on internalized oppression, and if you're interested in reading it, I highly recommend it. Send me an email and I'll give you the full citation. She says that we need to conceptualize internalized oppression at the structural level in order to actually expose rather than hide systemic racism, or sexism, or classism, or heterosexism, or any of the isms. So Pike says that we need to think of internalized oppression as multidimensional because it manifests differently for different groups in different contexts, and also as inevitable because we all participate in a society that currently and for the foreseeable future is structured by privilege and oppression. But we have to begin with some baseline understanding of the fact that members of oppressed groups are not immune to the negative messages that they receive about themselves and others like them. And from there, we can work to more deeply understand how these messages infiltrate and impact the thought processes and actions of all of us, so that we can we can learn how to put up a stronger resistance to the inequalities that all of us help to reproduce. And then I just wanted to, this is actually one of the big powwows in Ohio is at a campground called the Mohican Reservation. Interestingly, because Ohio doesn't have any Indian reservations, or federally recognized tribes for that matter. So we have Indian Chief Mohican John says, thanks, have a safe journey, see you next trip. Thank you.
Professor Jacobs has left lots of time for questions and interactions, so almost half an hour. So, questions?
Very nice, thank you.
Thank you.
If you've studied the Indian nationalism, if there's been any impact, I don't know if there's more people from India in America than possibly natives, if that's having some effect, or the rise of Hindu nationalism in India that might play on the scenes in Indian communities here.
So I think the demographers have tried to sort of sort out who's identifying as American Indian, right? So they've done a fair amount of studies to make sure that Indian folks from India aren't being mixed up with American Indians. Was that your question?
No, about the rise of Hindu nationalism in India.
I know nothing about the rise of Hindu nationalism.
But where the politics are based on that there'd be some sort of rise of tribal nationalism in America, the rise of candidates or theocracies developing on reservations.
Yeah, I don't know. What I do know is that the number of people identifying as American Indian has increased exponentially, And some of that, Nagel study, for instance, Nagel suggests that that's because of like the Red Power movement of the 1970s and this idea that being white is boring and being American Indian is more exciting, so more people are identifying as such. Yeah.
I have three questions actually. I'll get them up simultaneously. My first one is that when I watch a lot of Canadian, I'm on the board and I pick up a lot of Canadian television. And I noticed that Canadian media is much more obsessed with native Canadians than they are. And it seems in the United States, the media here doesn't focus on natives at all. Question two then is related to the idea that it seems to me like there were mixed marriages among native people, and that may have created a kind of identity problem. But mixed marriages, the same among blacks or other ethnic groups, were pretty rare, but they seem to occur a lot with natives or Indian. That is my next question. The thing was, let's not use the word Indian, let's use native. Then they said, no, don't use native, because then they went back to say Indian. So where are we? There's a whole bunch of things that seems to be going on.
Okay, so let me tackle the second question first about the naming issue. I was actually talking to Dina about it right at the beginning. So, and I should have just made a disclaimer actually about the language that I use, because the debates are ongoing about what is the appropriate terminology to use. I use American Indian in my writing because that's the federal government's designation, and that plays a large role in how the people that I worked with, how they experience their identities, whether or not the government recognizes them or not, right? So that's why I use American Indian in writing. I say Indian a lot, and I say Native a lot, because that's how the people that I worked with referred to themselves most often. And also because I was an AmeriCorps Vista after I got my bachelor's degree in anthropology, stationed on the Navajo reservation. And when I first got there, I only said Native American because that is what I had learned in college to say, and everyone laughed at me. So because I was a laughingstock, because that was too PC, because that was just silly, and no one ever said Native American on the reservation. They were Indians, sometimes N, D, N, 3 letters, Indians. Almost always natives. Native is accepted almost across the board, as far as I know, with all of the people I've had contact with. So yeah, there are lots of debates about what is the appropriate terminology. And as far as intermarriage, what was the specific question?
It seems to me like, unlike other racially oppressed groups in the United States, it seems there were more mixing marriages among Native Americans, but it was much rarer, but it's much more common today among African Americans and others. But I wonder if this led to a problem for American Indians. That's why you're wondering about the identity, because they were kind of accepted and then kind of, so it seems to me that that's the reason I think they have these issues.
Right. So, and there's been intermarriage and intermixing since Europeans first arrived here. So oftentimes, for instance, the stereotypical image of a native person, like the Google image search, is oftentimes a Plains Indian person, like someone from the Midwest. And the population out there there was less mixing for less years, I guess you would say, right? So like folks from the Eastern Seaboard are more likely to not fit into that stereotypical image of what an Indian looks like. So there's that. Then also, yes, like in terms of bloodlines and being enrolled in tribes, so there are 566 federally recognized tribes right now. There are other tribes in addition to that are seeking recognition, once had it and potentially lost it during the termination era, for instance. And they all get to define for themselves who counts as a member of their tribe. So not all of them use blood quantum, but blood quantum is the most common regulatory mechanism, as I said. And then blood quantum, sometimes like with the Cherokee tribe, some folks are really unhappy with the way that the Cherokee Nation does it because you just have to prove descent. So you could be 1,000th Indian, and as long as you can trace that bloodline through birth and death certificates, then you can still become an enrolled member. But for other tribes, you have to prove that you had a grandparent who was full blood. So, like some of the folks, actually Barbara, who was quoted here, she talks about it as being a form of genocide, right? That so interestingly enough, here's an interesting example, and every nation is different. But Barbara is Seminole and Cherokee. So her dad was Seminole, her mom was Cherokee, but she could only enroll in one tribe. So she's enrolled with the Cherokee tribe, and the Cherokee tribe will not recognize the Seminole part of her. So on her CDIB, it says that she's 50% Cherokee, not 100% Indian, right? So her daughter then is only 25% Indian, and if her daughter marries a white person, then that child will only be, an 1/8 Indian. And so it is a way of weaning out, the population of politically recognized American Indian people. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, Michelle. It was great. To build on what you were just last talking about, like with your Pike quote at the end, is if I already understand that argument correctly, is like that we should look at internalized oppression as a way to read the larger structures that provide this logic, right? That's where we see it manifest, and so we can begin to critique these structures. Is that Pike's argument?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, because that's, I think that's the fascinating part about this assimilist logic, right? That forever there were policies that encouraged intermarriage and literally the elimination of history, language, all these sorts of things, and then the second step of the assimilist project then is to have a policy that requires a certain level of authenticity that's virtually impossible to prove given the other side of the equation, and so like given the unique stakes for these communities, it doesn't surprise me at all that they're constantly contradicting and even aware of their own contradictions where they're like, God, I just did that, I'm not supposed to do that, but the desire to keep the wannabes out that are constantly trying to claim a tradition that's, either wholly not theirs, or the difficulty of proving yet one identifies and knows of a cultural relationship that they can't prove to get a card. It's just that's what brought me to study this group probably as well with you, is just this incredible dynamics at play that create all of these sort of contradictions, and so I think that Pike argument is a really interesting one because it's so hard if you just sort of look at the policies or you look at individualized statements to understand, well, wait, like, why did these fights happen? Or why is AIM going after Ward Churchill? Or the whole Andrea Smith debate that recently came up. Like,
right.
Those debates, there's just such a deep level of complexity behind them that, you can't appreciate unless you understand that logic that's governing it.
Yeah, and no one can measure up to this yardstick of who is Indian enough, right? Because to be Indian enough or to be real enough, you have to be caught in the snapshot in history. You have to exist in the 17th or 18th century. And the groups that I participated in didn't like each other, right? So the relocators called the reclaimers wannabes. They called their powwow that they organized a Boy Scout powwow. They went to the powwow and they vended their crafts, right? And they danced. So they would go to it and support it in that way. But then, and I guess that's why it's important that this research is ethnographic too, because if I interviewed folks, the relocators would say, oh, I have a granddaughter with blue hair or with blue eyes and blonde hair, and Indians come in all colors, and then you're hanging out with them and they're like, yeah, those are wannabes. Yeah.
I had a question. I wanted to know about contamination from westernized culture, what exactly does that mean? Is it like saying that they don't adopt any of the cultures? When they move to like cities, they just bring their own culture, and that's just where they live, and how do they get around it? Like, 'cause if you're in it, like how do you?
Exactly. They don't get around it, and they don't even want to. But
Okay.
for some reason, people expect them to like remain pure and untouched. So a really good example of this was actually in graduate school. A student, a graduate student who was in my cohort. Actually, I was telling him about my research a little bit, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I had a class where the professor offered me extra credit to go to a powwow, and I got there, and the Indians were wearing Nikes, and I was just like, I'm out of there, you know,
Wow.
like they weren't real. Apparently, if they were wearing Nikes, right?" Another example is a young woman that I interviewed. Her father was like identified as half-blood, I think. But she told me during the interview that at some point in time, she'd asked her dad, when she was just little, she admitted it to me as an embarrassing scenario, but when she was little, she'd asked her dad, "So when did you ride around on a horse and wear feathers?" You know, because like she knew her dad was an Indian. So at some point in his life, he must have done that, right? Yeah, so I mean, the folks in my study, they say that people ask them the most ridiculous things, you know, about ignorant, like little kids, for instance, who just really don't even know because they've only been exposed to these really stereotypical images. We'll ask them about teepees, and horses and feathers and whatnot, you know. And then people say things like, make jokes about peace pipes, you know, or I don't know, all kinds of stuff. I saw some more hands up back there. Yes.
I have two questions for you. My first one is, you talk a lot about the idea of Western contamination that's been sort of internalized by modern Native Americans. Would you say that it's a fair connection, that you can fairly connect that to the concept of the noble savage that we see in historical records? And then my second question is, you talk a lot about the families who are willing to adopt the reclaimers. Were there any sort of like shared characteristics among the adoptive families? Were certain people more likely to adopt a reclaimer than others?
I don't know, and I wish that I did. At one point in my project, I had this vision of actually going back to a reservation where someone had this mentoring experience with someone there, and then I never got to that point. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. What was the first question about?
Do you feel that the concept of Western contamination has sort of been internalized by do you think it's fair to say that that is sort of the concept of the noble savage being internalized by the community?
Yeah, I think that we all internalize all of these images about ourselves and others. Right? So, I mean, just to give another example of how, specifically with respect to the noble savage imagery is internalized, Barbara, again, she was in the military. That's how her and her husband were stationed in Hawaii, and that's how they met, and he was from Ohio, and they moved back to Ohio. She said that she was talking about how hard boot camp was and how it was this real awakening for her. Suddenly, you know, she had to be really tough and strong and everything, and she was like, but I wouldn't ever cry. Like, I would never let myself cry because I had this image in my head about, like, you know, American Indians, like Native people, we don't cry. Like, we're just tough and stuff like that. And I was like, well, where do you think that you got that idea from? She's like, I don't know. Well, do you think that you got it from your family? I don't know. You know, and I kept trying to, like, prod her for more information, but she was just like, I have no idea. I just thought that I had to be tough. Since you've already asked a question now, I forget your name. Marie.
Hi. I will self-identify as an urban Indian. I am both Canadian status and federally recognized here as well. I carry both cards because the BIA and INAC don't coincide with one another, so I actually am able to have both as opposed to if my father was Oneida from New York, that wouldn't have happened. I would have had to choose which one to go with. But because my father is Canadian, I don't have to. One of the questions I think this gentleman here asked about Canadian media, I think it's because of the population and identification. It has a lot to do with urban population of Indigenous people. I just moved back from, I was born and raised here. I was actually raised in Dearborn Heights. But my husband is Cree from Saskatchewan, Canada, and we moved out there for 3 years for him to work. And I lived in the town of Saskatoon, the city of Saskatoon. And it has a huge population of Indians, Indigenous natives, both that participate in the urban setting and those like ourselves. I consider my husband and our family, meaning my parents and my grandparents. Although we're urban, we don't really participate very often in a lot of the urban setting type of, it kind of goes back to the reclaimer and the relocator. We're more relocators. We identify as more relocators than reclaimers. So here in this community, we see a lot of reclaimers, a lot of things of question of how they participate in activities and the so-called ceremonial traditions, that because we are relocators, I'd like to state too that we participate traditionally, culturally on our home reservation. We don't seek the urban centers for that. Maybe if they have, for instance, I've gone to American Indian Health and Family Services for suicide prevention training. That's kind of my extent of what I used to work as a SOC grant participant and worked with their grant for them with mental health issues with children and urban Native families. So my extent of being an urban Indian varies with what is out there. Yeah. And it's really interesting how there's reclaimers and there's the relocators. I never heard of those terminologies until now.
I made them up, kind of.
Yeah, it's really, no, they really work because it's true. It's what you have for definition is exactly it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And it is interesting, because a lot of the relocators in Northeast Ohio, they did go home for ceremonies and stuff, but the largest populations were Navajo and Lakota, so their home was really far away. And so they also made do with this urban community, but there was lots of frustration among the elders in particular about how their kids didn't get enough exposure to their specific tribal cultures, right? And instead we're sort of adopting these pan-Indian ways.
That's true. I see that here as well. Like I stated, I'm both of a Three Fires Society. My mother is Odawa, so that's the Potawatomi, Odawa Ojibways, and the Potawatomi, Odawas, Chippewas. And here, I'm also Iroquois, so my father is Oneida. And a lot of things that they offer to the urban community here is more of the Three Fires. Although where I identify to, even though I carry both cards, where I practice more is my Iroquois traditions, and that's not so much here, even though my reserve's only 2 hours across the border.
Yeah.
So and we have a lot of urban, like my father's family relocated here for steel work. My grandfather came here for steel work, and so a lot of my immediate family are Iroquoian, but a lot of the practices that they provide here for urbans is of a different nation. And each nation is different, so with their practices, as you probably learned with the two of Lakota and Navajos, it's completely
Right. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we still have time for a couple more questions.
Professor.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk, it was nice. I was wondering, to follow up with some of these other comments as well, if you've considered the aspect of spatiality with respect to, I guess, kind of the angst people feel about their identities. Like if you were to do a comparative kind of investigation of people that live out west, for instance, that have their own bounded spatial locales, I don't know that you necessarily see as much angsting about, you know, how we're perceived exteriorly and as you might in the urban context. So there's an element, I think, probably of spatiality that might be interesting to explore, as well as also of materiality in how the material accoutrements that people use help to construct their identities in these different contexts.
Yeah, yes, thank you. And it is important to mention, actually, that in Northeast Ohio, because there's not a visible population of indigenous folks around, there's this more romanticized idea about Indianness, right? So people want to be recognized as American Indian, and people who find out that someone is Indian want to like touch their hair or their clothes or know their real Indian name or something, you know. But in the West, where there are larger, more visible populations of American Indians on reservations or near reservations, and particularly in towns that border reservations, it's dangerous to be American Indian, to be identifiable as American Indian, right? Because there's a lot of violence enacted on indigenous folks. So there's this totally different, that's where the drunken, dirty Indian stereotype is much more prolific, right? As opposed to the romantic, noble, savage stereotype.
Yeah, you did mention in your talk, but I know quite a few people in this area that the conversion, people who I'd say 0% Indian but went through initiation rites and have not just Lakota, but mostly Lakota, and have authority to conduct rituals, sweat lodges, sun dances, different things, and maybe they would be classified as a wannabe somewhat, but at the same time, if some of the tribes have repackaged themselves as a religion that doesn't have any blood quanta, and say, no, this person went through the initiation, they're 100% Indian, even though they have 0% Indian blood. They're sanctioned to do this ritual. That person who's 100% Indian, who did not go through the initiation rites, has no right to represent the religion.
Yes, and it's really very messy, right? So everyone has a different idea of what a real, authentic Indian is. It's just like the relocators say that the reclaimers aren't authentic because they're obviously white folks, right, who didn't grow up practicing Indian traditions. But the reclaimers say that the relocators aren't Indian enough because if they were real Indians, then they wouldn't be so concerned about things like CDIBs, because that's a governmental...
Are converts included as reclaimers then?
Are converts... yeah, I actually didn't encounter folks like that in my study. But my point was just that I think some people would accept those people as Indians and some people would not accept those people as Indians, right? That it's just too messy. All right, well, I think it's about time and folks are leaving. So I think I have some signatures to give students. And thank you all for being here.